Mm-hmm.
There we go. Can you see that, TJ?
I can. Just to make sure I can navigate. Perfect. Super. Thank you very much, Lucia.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. So, look, my name is Tygo Callig. I'm from Ireland, and what I'm going to talk about this morning is asynchronous language learning, student-informed strengths and shortcomings. And I suppose just to give you a little bit of context to begin with, where this is going to go, the next 20 minutes should look like this. First of all, I'll define what immersion education is. Next, we'll go on and we'll talk about teacher language immersion awareness. I'll talk a little bit about the specific study that I'm going to share with you this morning, and then to obviously share the findings, the strengths and indeed the shortcomings from a student perspective of asynchronous language learning, and obviously conclude the presentation also. So just to give you a brief background of immersion education. And again, immersion education is a type of bilingual education, a form of bilingual education in which students receive subject matter instruction or content matter instruction through the medium of a second foreign heritage or indigenous language. And in Ireland, we do have a model of immersion, Irish medium immersion. We have 3 official languages here in Ireland. The first official language being Irish, the second being English, and the third sign language, Irish Sign Language. And we have immersion schools all around the country, and Irish is not the spoken language of the students in those schools, in their family, in their home situation, or in their locality. So when the majority of these students come into these centres or these schools, they learn Irish through content, and they meet Irish for the first time in kindergarten. So they learn content and language at the same time in this bilingual immersion model. And at the moment, Irish medium education caters for 1 in every 16 students in the Republic of Ireland. And this figure is always expanding because parents and caregivers and guardians see the advantages of their children being bilingual from a very, very young age. Just like Anna was talking about there, the advantages of being bilingual. And obviously there's the national language as well. Parents really wish for their children to be fluent speakers of their national language, but also the academic achievement from these schools. And we've much research that points to the academic achievement of these immersion schools and how these students surpass their peers in monolingual English schools, where they're learning Irish as a second language. So this is a real attraction for parents, and this model of education in Ireland is really growing. But however, it takes a really talented and skilled teacher to work in these settings. And the skill set and the knowledge base that is required to teach effectively in these immersion settings is much more robust than that needed of a teacher who is teaching a group of monolingual children through the language of their home language. So teaching a group of linguistically diverse students who are learning the language of instruction as they're learning the content requires a specific knowledge base and a specific immersion pedagogy. But one of those essential facets of that knowledge base is immersion teacher language awareness. Because if the immersion teacher isn't a competent and fluent and accurate user and of the immersion language, there is an issue, because as we know, each content area brings with it its own terminology, its own complex grammar, maybe a tendency to use particular genres in writing, and a specific suite of language functions, especially aligned with the demands and the needs of that subject area. So if the teacher isn't a very accurate and knowledgeable user of the immersion language, there is an issue. And we have research in Ireland that shows that, and it's not international research also, which shows that it's not just enough to be communicative and fluent in the immersion language. You need that really knowledge of form and that metalinguistic knowledge, that language awareness. And when we talk about language awareness, we're not just talking about communicative ability, or we're not just talking about fluency. We're talking about 3 particular components. One, what does the teacher understand or believe about language and language use? What are their beliefs about language acquisition? and what are their motivations for being an effective user of that language, or what are their attitudes towards language learning. So coupled with that and those dispositions, we also have a component here where the knowledge of underlying systems of language is absolutely important also. So what do teachers understand, by language? Their level of metalinguistic awareness, what is their knowledge of different varieties of language, different dialects? What is their knowledge of complex syntax and grammar and lexicon? What is their knowledge of the demands and the features of particular lessons or particular content? So again, that is quite a high demand on teachers, to have that really depth of knowledge when it comes to the nuts and bolts and architecture of the immersion language. And the third component, it's not just good enough to have a positive attitude, to be motivated, to be a very knowledgeable user of the language, and to have a very accurate grip of that language. Those two on their own are useless if you do not have the capacity and the ability to engage in pedagogy that enables you to translate that declarative knowledge into procedural knowledge in pedagogy. So that pedagogical knowledge about teaching language, how do I teach language effectively, but in the immersion context, how do I teach language effectively through content? And that's the area that needs lots of attention and care when it comes to bilingual and immersion education. And I know in Italy that you have CLIL, and that there are struggles also highlighted with teacher competency in the language of instruction, and how that competency in the language of instruction impacts not only on teaching but also on learning. So it's quite a challenging situation. So when it comes to Ireland, and this is just Irish research, we have lots of research that points to the demands of immersion teaching in Ireland. And these demands really, this research mirrors a lot of what is happening internationally. For example, teachers in Ireland in the immersion settings are challenged to conceptualize what content and language integration is. What does it mean? What does it look like? How do I plan for it? How do I enact it? How do I assess it? How do I evaluate it? And how do I behave as a teacher when it comes to content and language integration? The other challenge they have is crafting opportunities for sustained output. How do I ensure that I can orchestrate situations for my students in the immersion classroom to use the target language in a very structured and focused and communicative way, while ensuring to use the new language of the content area in very complex ways? So that is a constant struggle for immersion teachers. Also, when it comes to planning, what is involved in planning? What about the language outcomes of the content lesson? What about the content outcomes of the language lesson? Where do they meet? And what are the components of an effective language and content integrated lesson? Is there an overemphasis on content? How do I infuse language into the content? So planning an effective language and content integrated lesson is also a challenging experience for teachers. And doing that on a whole school basis is even more challenging. So differentiated content and language teaching, again, how do I give effective feedback on language and content in an integrated manner? How do I accommodate all the learning needs and styles in the classroom? Maybe students who are new to the language of instruction, but who are very much engaged with the content. And how do I accommodate those struggling learners who are struggling academically with the content perhaps, but maybe not so with the language? So how do I design differentiated support in a language and content integrated manner for my students? And the other area that needs attention in Ireland, and again which mirrors the international research, is how do I integrate a focus on form in my teaching? Because the results of immersion and the outcomes of immersion and bilingual education sometimes, and the international picture would tell us, that students from the immersion model are very fluent speakers, they're very competent speakers, they're very confident speakers, and they're very motivated to use that language. But however, they are inaccurate, and certain linguistic features become fossilized in their language, and it is very hard to move over that plateau. So how do I, as a teacher, ensure that these fossilized structures become unfossilized? And how do I integrate that pedagogy in my teaching and learning in a content-based environment? Again, another challenge for the teachers. So another challenge is the overuse of English. Some teachers in immersion use English because they think, look, it's quicker for students to access understanding. Should I use translanguaging, or should I use code switching maybe in my instruction? But again, that has an effect on how accurate children become in the target language. If there's an overuse of English, the common language of the classroom, that impacts on the ability to ensure that children are accurate users of the target language, if they feel that there's always an opportunity to use English. So again, the integrated content and language assessment in Ireland, there are high stakes exams which are very much focused on content alone. It's a constant conversation with our department. How do we ensure that high stakes exams in immersion models, that there are a percentage of marks awarded for language and accurate language also? Because if children and students are being assessed on language, on content alone, they do not pay attention to accuracy in language production. And that is an area as well about expectations and status of the language when it comes to national examinations. So that's just a brief context or background, just to, I suppose, contextualize the piece of research here. And the piece of research that I want to share with you is very much about these types of teachers who are teaching in immersion settings in Ireland. And we have a program in my university, Masters of Irish Medium Immersion Education. So these teachers, immersion teachers, we're all engaging with this master's program at my university. I am the coordinator of that program. And what we really looked at with this cohort of students, 30 practicing immersion teachers, we really looked at how we can develop their teacher language awareness through an asynchronous provision. So asynchronous provision, like Anna was talking about earlier, accessing and engaging with learning anytime, anywhere, using any device at their own pace. So again, how do we craft and design a learning experience which is asynchronous, which enables teachers to develop their teacher language awareness to enable them to become more effective in their immersion classrooms? So we map their journey over a 12-week semester. That's our semester in Ireland. A 12-week semester, we mapped their journey, their asynchronous journey online as they engaged with this 12-week module. So we had 30 practicing immersion teachers. They were all from various backgrounds. They had all different class grades, different learning experience, needs, dispositions. The CEFR was just to get a baseline. We use the CEFR to assess, teachers' entry levels when it came to the language awareness, and also at the exit of the 12, and it's only 12 weeks, but at the exit we measured it and we used the self-assessment grid as well. So teachers were able to measure and provide evidence of their own progress over the weeks also. So we collected data using end of module evaluations. We engaged with focus groups, obviously the students' work and the tutor observations also. And we analyzed the data using thematic analysis. So when it comes to the findings, what exactly did we find? So first of all, the students really highlighted numerous strengths of the asynchronous provision and the impact of that asynchronous provision on language learning or teacher language awareness. First of all, they really, it came through in the findings from the data that they became more self-assessed continually, and self-assessment and target setting became a very natural and embedded practice for them as they traveled throughout this 12-week semester. They constantly used the CEFR grid to map their level of competence across all the skills, and they worked on specific tasks and provided evidence of learning as they moved through the grades across the different skills. So, and they really reported that digital technologies enable them to plan, to monitor, to reflect on their own learning, and provide evidence of progress and sharing those insights and coming up with creative solutions. So this idea of community online, Even though it was asynchronous, they shared their evidence, they shared their dilemmas, they solved solutions together, and they really scaffolded the learning process as a group. And this really aided and supported the self-assessment and target setting. Also, the degree of flexibility was noted as being very positive to language learning. It afforded them much flexibility, it stimulated them, they could learn at their own pace, they became autonomic, or I suppose that level of autonomy was really featured. They become reflective practitioners. They really linked their language learning to their own classrooms in a very practical way. And the language learning journey was very meaningful for them because they were able to impact and embed their practices and test their practices when it came to language learning in their own classrooms also. They became highly motivated, and they became very stimulated to question assumptions, to interpret, to induct, to deduct, to argue, to evaluate, and then cultivating this way of thinking and this new set of skills. So they really became analysts of language, looking at language in a new way, analyzing their language use, recording their language use, and then listening back and recording and setting targets as a result. So they became much more in tune with their competency, and much more aware of their own level of competence and the level of that competence on student language learning. However, they did note that there were also shortcomings for the asynchronous. Super. 5 minutes. Super. We're on target, I hope. So there are shortcomings here where self-regulation, seeing as they weren't in class or seeing as the provision was not synchronous, some learners felt that it was very hard to self-regulate and to have a degree of self-control, to engage in a very structured way and in a consistent manner over the weeks. So that self-regulation was a new skill that they had to use, because in any learning experience in a university before, this asynchronous provision was new to them. So this was a skill that they had to master, that they were in control of their learning journey, and that self-regulation was a challenge for them. The lack of online language use and interaction was also noted as a challenge. Some people longed for the live synchronous sessions, or maybe the face-to-face sessions, where that spontaneous conversations can happen, and that social learning can happen in a very natural environment also. That was noted as a challenge and something that was missing from the learning journey. The social isolation also, students felt that perhaps, even though there was a community online, that spontaneity was missing, and that real classroom environment, and that was a word that came through time and time again, was really missing on occasion, and that some people felt isolated as a result of this asynchronous provision only. So there are lessons here for us. Asynchronous on its own works for sure, but perhaps it can be complemented with synchronous or face-to-face. And again, coming back from our students, from our findings, that seems to be what they see as working best for them. So these findings, they illustrate several points of access into classroom research and pedagogy, and they uncover core aspects of high impact asynchronous language learning experiences. So this informs us how we can craft better and design and develop better and more effective experiences for our learners as we move forward. Also, the study contributes to a greater understanding of how teacher language awareness in immersion can develop using technology-enhanced tasks and engagements. And it shows us that there really is compelling evidence, that technology-enhanced experiences in an asynchronous manner really can lend themselves to that conscious raising and critical language awareness potential, and enable teachers to become much more analytic, much more reflective, much more competent users of the immersion language. So, grazie mille. I think we're there.
Okay, thank you very much.